Good morning and good evening to all. I am Sourabh Gupta of ICAS, the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to the World Salon ICAS event titled The Ripple Effects of Trump's Reciprocal Tariffs. We have five great distinguished speakers out here to discuss the topic of course, President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, the April 2nd tariffs, but we are going to expand the discussion a little more in terms of not just the Liberation Day tariffs, but the US tariff policy under the Trump administration, its impact on North America particularly, as well as trans-Pacific supply chains. We have a lot to discuss out here, especially with the Canadian election just having happened a couple of days back, and with Canadian Prime Minister due in Washington today. Format of the event is that we will have the five speakers, each of them speak for about 6 to 8 minutes. After each speaker speaks, all the other panelists can join in a conversation session with that speaker for another 8 minutes. It could be comments, it could be questions, etc., and then we will move on to our next speaker. Our very first speaker is Mr. Patrick Leblond, Professor Patrick Leblond. He's from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sourabh. Pleasure to be here. Yes, this is a momentous moment, if we can say. Yes, Prime Minister Carney is actually in Washington today, supposed to speak to President Trump. We'll see what comes out of it. As the world has discovered, this new administration obviously has gone much further than anyone anticipated. I think even a few months ago, as to how far the tariffs would be imposed at large when there were already obviously threats, but no one thought that it would go this far. And certainly from a Canadian perspective, it's been a shock, to say the least, in terms of the level of threats. I mean, obviously, then there have been adjustments because of the USMCA, but nevertheless, it was seen like, why is this? You know, we've been a good partner to the US. We do business together. We build things together. Why this change and why these attacks? And not to mention, obviously, the attacks, the threats of whether it's an invitation or a threat is still not clear, but for Canada to become the 51st state of the United States. So it's in that context that newly elected Prime Minister, although he was appointed Prime Minister before the election, Mark Carney is in Washington today to, in a way, try to figure out what this administration wants from Canada. We hear, obviously, Mr. Trump and others say that Canada is taking advantage of the United States, that the United States is subsidizing Canada, numbers that cannot be verified in any way. We're talking about, Trump talks about $200 billion, even though not clear where those numbers come from. So Mr. Carney is here trying to figure out and start a dialogue. As he said himself, do not expect white smoke after this meeting. Certainly the idea is not to come to a deal, but maybe to start setting the path for some kind of agreement that, from a Canadian perspective, could eliminate the tariffs that have been imposed, and certainly the threat of tariffs, because it's not just, as we know, the tariffs themselves, but it's the threat which hurts business, which hurts investment on both sides of the border, let alone jobs and everything that goes with it. Now, the big question, at least on the Canadian side, but I think that's the same question on the US side, and I think our Mexican friends are also very interested in what's going to come out of these things, because it will influence, I think, their own discussions, if not negotiations, with the Americans, and whether there will be a trilateral negotiation or just bilateral ones remains to be seen. But what would go into a deal? Up until, let's say, a few months ago, the assumption was that we would be talking about, or we were talking about, the renegotiation of the USMCA in 2026. The idea that after 6 years, it was the launch of a review, right, a mandated review in the agreement that could last up to 10 years, right? And if not, after 16 years, it's the end of the agreement unless the three parties want to continue. So that was the assumption under which we were all working, that it would be kind of a tweaking exercise, more or less. Not a complete renegotiation, but yes, there would be some demands from the US side, some demands from the Canadian sides, playing defensive, also same thing for the Mexicans. But now it seems that that's out of the question, or it's not clear whether that's the question. Are we talking about a different type of agreement? Some people talk about an economic security agreement between Canada and the United States. Now, what would that look like? What would that entail? What could Canada offer the US, and what do we get in return? Do we just get, again, lower tariffs and the removal of the threat of tariffs? Although with this administration, as we know, deals can be made, but doesn't mean that they're going to be respected. So it's in that context where I think Mr. Carney, the decision to come so early to speak to President Trump is to try to get a sense of whether a deal is possible, what kind of deal might be possible. Are we going to talk about the nitty-gritty of, let's say, digital trade, or looking at dispute settlement mechanisms, or supply management in dairy in Canada? Like, are these the kinds of deals or that elements are we looking for, or are we looking for something bigger? Access to resources. We know that the United States just signed an agreement with Ukraine to gain access and certain degree of control over their critical minerals. Is that something that President Trump and his administration would like to have from Canada's perspective? We have critical minerals. They're not as exploited as much as they could or should. Is that what is going to be part of these conversations? We just don't know. That's the main problem, is that we've been accused of a bunch of things, which from our part do not make sense. Whether it's fentanyl immigration, that's not an issue as far as we are concerned, even for the US. On the other hand, we've been attacked and threatened with all sorts of things. So what does the US want, and how can Canada provide this? Is it possible? We don't know. And I think that's what Prime Minister Carney's visit is trying to assess. Whether it will lead to anything, that remains to be seen. We've seen many such visits from leaders around the world, and they went back and like, well, we don't know. We don't really know more than we knew coming in. So it is a possibility, but at least as long as there is a dialogue, I guess that's the positive thing. And I'll stop here.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Patrick. I have a bunch of questions. I don't want to preempt others, but please jump in whenever you wish to. Patrick, one of the questions, one point I wanted to get, and it's a similar question I will have for Peter also, is that, for example, Canada has had auto supply chains from the 1960s, integrated auto supply chains with the US from the 1960s. Are we seeing kind of a disentangling of these supply chains which run through Canada and Mexico? And my basic point is this, Biden had talked about friendshoring and nearshoring, but for America, is it only reshoring, and is friendshoring and nearshoring dying? Is that the goal? Do you think that's the goal of what Trump is doing? Yeah.
The answer is no one knows. And it seems the industry doesn't know either. And it seems it's not even clear that the administration knows exactly what it wants. Yes, we hear about reshoring. Certainly, we don't hear so much about friendshoring anymore. This seems to be about, at least what we hear from Commerce Secretary Lutnick, Donald Trump, and all that, is that, yes, the United States, the administration wants more manufacturing production in the United States, right? And it seems that a lot of the tariffs that have been imposed are focused on bringing operations and activities on US soil. Now, in that context, and certainly in the automobile sector, it's clear that disentangling these things is going to take time and it's going to cost a lot of money. Even if the tariffs go up, it's not clear that plants in the US can survive without suppliers in Canada or suppliers in Mexico and vice versa. Because as we all know, we've seen the graphs, right? Things move back and forth across the borders until final assembly, which can be in Mexico, which can be in Canada, which can be in the US. So obviously, if it starts costing too much, well, then operations will close, right? We've already seen some assembly plants at least closed temporarily. We know suppliers are being threatened. We know foreign suppliers, which have productions in the US, have decided to, instead of exporting from the US, let's say to Canada or even to Mexico, now they're going to export from Japan or Korea. Because obviously between Canada, I'm using the Canadian example, Canada and Japan or Canada and Korea, we have free trade and we have no tariffs, right? So they're going to say, okay, well, yes, we had set up in the US to serve the North American market, but now because of all the uncertainty and all the tariffs, and we're going to actually serve the Canadian market from abroad. So we're going to see a realignment, at least to some extent for now. But the real risk is that over time, if this is really what the Trump administration wants, is that cars that are made for the American market in America, not in Mexico, not in Canada, with no parts coming from these countries, yes, eventually it will mean the end of the integrated North American auto industry and supply chains. And the big question for Canada is that then, how much can we survive in that context? I can't speak to Mexico, but certainly for Canada, assembling cars in Canada will probably not be economical anymore. I'm sure that we have some major suppliers, car part suppliers that probably could survive. It would be a shock, but they could serve markets abroad and all that. But certainly there would be a big question mark on the survival of the auto industry in Canada, at least in terms of making cars, assembling cars, that's for sure.
Great. Let me come to also one final question to you. Mr. Carney has talked about kind of Canada needs to diversify its relationships, but Canada already is in CPTPP. It already has a free trade agreement with the European Union. So with all its major partners, of course, China is the one area where relations economic ties can become denser, but political relations are a little complicated. So how can that relationship be diversified? What are Canada's options in that regard?
Yeah, so I think the logic right now, the strategy, at least as far as I understand it, and listening to Prime Minister Carney during the election campaign, is that the United States has become an unreliable partner. We can't trust this administration, and it's not clear that things will go back to whatever normal is in 4 years' time. So right now it's almost the idea is, okay, plan for the worst, hope for the best. And in our case, from the Canadian perspective, this means, yes, we need to reduce our dependence on the US economy. We also need to reduce our dependence on the US for security. Now, this is easier said than done. Because we are highly economically and in terms of security, highly integrated with the US. But we have no choice, because what we're seeing is that the more integrated we are, the more our access to the US and certainly the security kind of protections we get from the US can be weaponized. And we're seeing the Trump administration weaponize that access all over the world right now. So there's going to be, the plan is to, one, be more productive at home, maybe do more business across Canada, because right now there are a lot of firms that, let's say if they're in Quebec or they're in British Columbia or Alberta, it's easier to do business with the US than to do business across Canada. So making those things easier, there's a lot of discussions and looking at removing provincial barriers to trade, especially in terms of regulations and standards. We have a lot of free trade agreements with the rest of the world, and we can use those as a basis for further trade. But the big challenge for Canada is that we're mostly small and medium-sized enterprises, and for them, it's a lot easier to do business in the U.S., right? It's, time zones, language, culture, proximity. It's easier. Not saying it's easy, but it's much easier than going to Asia or going to Europe or even to Latin America for that matter. So for that, it's going to require a lot more work and certainly a lot of more support, and that support is going to have to come from government in terms of kind of almost hand-holding these companies over time to develop these markets. It's not just say, hey, here's a nice fact sheet about doing business in Japan or doing business in Korea or in China or in Singapore. We know that these markets take a long time to develop, and companies will say, well, I don't have the resources, I don't have the knowledge, I don't have the time, I don't have the money. So in order to help this, it's not enough just to have a free trade agreement. There's going to have to be a sort of business government partnership at the federal level, provincial level, in some cases even many municipalities, to help these companies both have the resources to export beyond the United States, but also to develop those markets and build those relationships. And that's going to take a lot of resources and a lot of time, but we don't have that much time. So we need to get going at the same time as we need to manage our access to the US market, but we can't count on it anymore. That's the problem.
Thanks, Patrick. That's great. Enrique, let's get to you. Enrique Dussel Peters, Professor Enrique is with the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here, and thank you very much to ICAS for the invitation. I would like to begin from a broader perspective. So today we are witnesses of a profound shift in the world order. The United States, the founder of the current world order, with the so-called Bretton Woods institution since 1944, is retracting the founder and saying, I will not participate under the rules that I established several decades ago, which means that multilateralism, reciprocity, the national treatment, the foundations of the current world order will not work today and in the short term. Based on that, I would invite to consider two concepts. First, the concept of new triangular relationships. What we are witnessing today is not the Cold War or the new Cold War, no, but what we are witnessing is a profound confrontation between the United States and China, at least since 2017, the first presidency of Donald Trump, in which he highlights this great power competition. I will get back to that. And within this world, in this great power competition, what we are witnessing is the confrontation of the two biggest economies of the world. And the big question is, what will third regions, countries, from Russia to Mexico to Belize, Guatemala, and Germany, how are we going to react, also Canada, in this confrontation? No? And regarding hundreds of topics, from Confucius Institutes to 6G to you name it, hundreds of issues that we will have to deal with pragmatically. A second topic I would invite you to consider is, and note the irony, in trying to go beyond the fashion of these shorings, no? Onshoring, offshoring, nearshoring, ally-shoring, and you name it, lots of shorings, no? And you ask the speaker, what do you mean by this shoring? And well, they tell you it's the relocation of processes. I work on development and industrial organization, Mexico and Central America. We have been benefiting since the 1960s. This is 60 plus years on the relocation of processes. I would invite you to consider the concept with a little bit of irony, but very seriously, the concept of security shoring. in space and time, which means since 2022, not January 20th, since 2022, Jake Sullivan, Janet Zellen, of course, the White House and Joe Biden have been highlighting our national security, the United States, is going to be the main topic in our relationship with or against China, as you wish, no? Security shoring. And so concepts such as free trade agreements, but also Confucius Institutes. No? China has closed 100 plus Confucius Institutes in the last 5 years in the United States, but also innovation, electric vehicles, and whatever you can imagine will fall under the heading of the United States, national security. This is fundamental for Canada, Mexico, but also for third countries. The question is, Mexico, will you participate in my strategy against China, or will you be on the other side? And if you participate in this security process, security shoring process, you will probably benefit, otherwise get used to the impact that this might generate. I will finalize in 2-3 minutes with two final topics. No? Imagine the situation of Mexico regarding this new triangular relationship. Based on input-output tables in the last years, we calculated the Chinese value added in Mexican exports to the United States. So in 1995, the Chinese value added in Mexican exports to the US, 1995 was 0%. 2020, the last data we have, it was 7.5%. So rapid growth of Chinese parts and components of a good that says made in Mexico, a laptop or a car, made in Mexico, 7.5% made with Chinese value added. But who imports Chinese value added? 70% of Mexican imports are pursued by transnational corporations and mainly US American firms. So the main importer of Chinese imports in Mexico is General Motors. The main importer of cars fabricated in China is not BYD, BAIC, SAIC. It is again General Motors. 60% of cars fabricated made in China are Ford, Stellantis, and General Motors. If we do not understand this new triangular relationship, and I believe these erratic discussions by Trump and executive orders, etc., this political discussion does not understand the industrial organization that we have been witnessing in the 21st century. Finally, and beyond political discussions in DC, in Ottawa, in Mexico, and wherever you can imagine, the presence of China continues to grow in Latin America and in Mexico. In 2024, Chinese imports from a Mexican perspective broke the barrier of 20%. For the first time since we have statistics, Chinese imports accounted for more than 20%. Again, remember who is doing these imports, mainly transnational corporations. Finally, I would simply highlight and try to understand, we discuss a lot of times regarding tariffs, growth, whatever, but we have little understanding of what were the tariffs in 2024. No? Mexico paid a tariff of 0.26%. China paid a tariff a little bit above 10%. I'm always speaking of the United States. So if we're suddenly speaking of Mexico paying 25%, China paying tariffs above 260% maximum, because in most of these discussions, we tend to forget what China already was paying in 2024. So we are speaking of 245% maximum plus 10 to 15%. So we are speaking the business as usual will not continue. Neither the USMCA, here we could have a good discussion with Patrick, USMCA is abolished because we are speaking of unilateral measures globally against Canada, against Mexico, in which Trump says, my friends, we are having a third or fourth column regarding my unilateral decisions. There will be very little to renegotiate in 2026, no? But again, business as usual today will not continue, again, because Mexico paid 0.26% of tariffs, and we are now probably going to pay between 25 to 50% in average for tariffs. No? So again, thank you very much for the invitation.
Thanks, Enrique. Please feel, I want to encourage the other participants to jump in. I have tons and tons of questions, but I don't want to preempt others. So please get in whenever. Thanks for making that point about security shoring, because I've talked to nearshoring, blah blah blah, but it's important because the way the U.S. this administration is defending its tariffs, both in quote out here, is that this is not just a mere tariff issue. This is a foreign and security policy issue. That's the argument it's making at home, and at the WTO, it's saying it's essential security interests, and therefore it's not adjudicable. Also, I enjoyed your point about the transnational corporations, and I think the Trump administration is facing that. It had its auto executive order and tariffs issued in, I think, in late March, and there's already been 3 evolutions of that executive order in this 1 month, because they're realizing how auto supply chains work and who the parties are being impacted are, the GMs, et cetera, and so they're trying to make workarounds out there. But if I can just ask you one question, Enrique. So where do you see in 2 years' time that triangular relationship between the United States, Mexico, and China? What do you see? Is it Mexico will be, because of pressure, forced to kind of China? China can come to Mexico, but China can produce for the rest of Latin America, not for the US market. How do you see that triangular relationship playing out?
If we take this concept seriously, new triangular relationship, this means that third countries, Canada, Mexico, but also Guatemala, Vietnam, and Germany, will have to propose strategies vis-a-vis both. No? In some cases, even in Washington, but also in Latin America, there are some sectors that are highlighting we have to to become partners of the United States, and let's forget about China. With this concept of new triangular relationships, this decision is not realistic. No, I don't put too many adjectives. We have to deal and propose an agenda, short, medium, and long term, vis-a-vis the United States, of course, and China. No? This is what we have been doing at our center very recently, 35 pages, 27 proposals, what to do in the next 6 years vis-a-vis China. No? So it's not China or the United States, but it's China and the United States from a very pragmatic perspective. And again, considering that, let's imagine one day without China and Mexico, we would have to walk barefoot, our cellular phones would not work, the metro station would not work, ports and airports would not work. This is not reasonable, to put it politely. No? So the presence of China is here. No, we cannot close our eyes and say, let's imagine China does not exist. And so does the United States. Welcome to a new triangular relationship, very complicated, as Patrick was already saying. No, very complicated. But again, it's not a matter of the US or China. No?
Yeah. Thanks, Enrique. In the interest of time, I'm going to go. Please go on.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to follow up on something that you alluded to, Enrique, which was also implicit in Patrick's comments, which is the death of international trade agreements. So fundamentally, what Donald Trump has done, he started this in his first administration, but certainly in his second administration, is simply repudiating the entire concept of a rules-based world trading system. So since 1995, from 1995 until 2017, we had a world trading system which was based on law and rules, and people generally followed it. The big countries, the small countries followed it. That ended under Trump 1.0. The demolition of the WTO by Trump 1.0 was not reversed by Biden at all. And certainly now with Trump 2.0, it's dead and buried. We no longer have a rules-based trading system. USMCA no longer exists. The rules governing tariffs between countries no longer exist. And this, to me, I think is something which has gotten less attention than it should in all these discussions of Trump's daily tariff announcements. All of this stuff is illegal. Everything Trump is doing is illegal under international law, under U.S. Treaties, under treaties passed, ratified by the United States Senate, and that's a fact which I think is we all need to be very aware of in trying to understand what's going forward. The rules-based system is over.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll come to that, James, because I think. Oh, yes, Patrick, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just quickly, I agree with James on that. I would just like to say that it might be over for the US and other countries, but it doesn't mean that it is and has to be for countries like Canada, Mexico, and Europe, and Japan, and Korea, etc. So there are a number of countries that still believe in a rules-based international order. The big challenge is how those countries outside without the US, but also facing pressure from the US, can maintain and even benefit among themselves of that kind of approach. So I'll just want to add that.
Yeah.
And
Please.
I always highlight the writing of Robert Lighthizer on February 6th in the New York Times. No, I think he's one of the few thinkers, to put it somehow, in the group around Trump, where he highlights what is happening and what we are witnessing in this change of a new world order is that we will end up with a much smaller group of friends of the United States. No, this is not going to be the World Trade Organization, but this is going to be the UK, maybe Canada, maybe Mexico, a couple of other friends, and the rest will not be part of this group of friends. No, so this is a profound change regarding again the Bretton Woods institutions, and we will be in the middle of a transition period full of uncertainties for countries, for firms, for global value chains, etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Enrique. Because I see questions in the Q&A which are also on that on that trilateral relationship point. Randall, you wanted to make a point. Go ahead.
Oh, well, just that the U.S. has a credibility problem in building a new relationship among friends. I mean, can they write a treaty that's worth more than the piece of paper it's written on? At this point, it's not entirely clear that they can constitutionally. And so it may be that the Americans have to do some internal rebuilding somehow so that they can sign a treaty and it actually means something, because otherwise I can't see them building any kind of a new relationship with Britain or any other country when they can't actually sign an agreement that they commit to live up to. That's kind of important. And so we're kind of in a situation like the League of Nations, which the US tried to build and then withdrew from. And middle powers tried to keep the League of Nations alive for a couple of decades after the US withdrew, but we couldn't do it. And that was because we kept each looking after our own interests first, hoping somebody else would stop Mussolini, hoping somebody else would stop Franco in Spain. Each of us, wanted to keep our heads down and let others pay the cost, and it just didn't work out, and the whole thing collapsed. So without the great powers involved, I don't know if we could do what you're suggesting. It'd be great if we could, but I'm not sure how we'd get around the collective action problem.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I mean a good analogy too. And again, in the interest of time, Randall, let me come to you. Why don't you provide your initial remarks,
Sure.
and we'll keep the conversation going thereafter. Professor Randall Morck is a distinguished chair at the University of Alberta and a research associate at National Bureau of Economic Research. Please go ahead.
Hi. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's hard to figure out what's going on because it doesn't really make sense. And we try to spin wheels and come up with different ways of making sense and coming up with reasons about what the US is trying to do. But every time I try to do that, it just doesn't add up. So the Americans talk about how they're subsidizing every other country and subsidizing Canada $200 billion a year. Well, I mean, they have a fair claim that Canada is not paying its 2% of NATO defense spending. If we did, that would cost us another $10 billion a year. So maybe the US is subsidizing us to $10 billion a year. The US trade in goods deficit with Canada is $60 billion a year, but the US has a trade in services surplus. That's Canadian companies buying consulting services and insurance and other things from the US that wipes out half of that. And there's a Canadian purchases of US financial securities, stocks and bonds and stuff that basically wipes out the rest of it. So it kind of nets out to nothing when you look at the numbers. There really isn't any there. Trump says things like the rest of the world has been stealing our jobs, cheating on trade, and so on. Well, you have to look at the history of actions against the US in NAFTA panels and in the World Trade Organization. The US has a long history of trying to cheat other countries. The US agricultural subsidies have been a bone of contention for a long time. The US repeatedly lost tribunals against Canada for softwood lumber over and over again. Finally, the Canadians agreed to a voluntary export restraint, and the first US victories were in private arbitration panels where they argued that Canada wasn't living up to the voluntary export restraint. But the US actually has been pretty consistently found to be violating international trade norms over and over again. The claims about national security, maybe the US is doing all of this to build up national security, but it doesn't look like it. So the claims about fentanyl pouring in across the Canadian border, it was, forgotten the number, 19.5 kilograms of fentanyl were seized on the Canadian border going into the US last year, out of hundreds of thousands of pounds of fentanyl flowing in from elsewhere. So the national security stuff looks like feint. It's hard to take it seriously. So then, okay, well, could it be that Trump is really actually serious about tariffs making America great again and somehow stimulating the economy? Well, from Latin America, you've had import substitution there as a policy across Latin America for a century. Raul Prebisch became famous telling Argentina that you should build huge tariff barriers and grow strong behind them, and it was a disaster. It never worked. There's no country in the history of the world, as far as I can tell, that actually got rich in a way that we can say tariffs helped the country get rich. There are studies on the McKinley tariffs in the 1890s in the US that show that American industries that were protected by higher tariffs had lower productivity coming out of the tariffs. There is a study looking at, I've forgotten how many countries here. It's 151 countries, all tariffs from 1963 to 2014. What happens after the average tariff? Productivity goes down, living standards go down, investments go down, innovation goes down. So tariffs tend to make countries poor. And the United States, if you're looking for an international analog, the closest thing I can see is Juan Perón in Argentina. He took a rich country, put up tariffs around it, made it a place where everybody had to do deals with him to get anything done. And where is Argentina now? It's the only country in the world that went from the first world to the third world. Nobody else has ever done that. And that's really quite an achievement. You know, if you think development economics is getting you from third world to first world, going the other way is just as hard. You have to do almost everything wrong. And tariffs were a big part of that. And the question is, why do tariffs do that? And I think the reasons have to go beyond comparative advantage. You know, Mexico grows mangoes, Canada grows maple syrup. We could grow mangoes in Canada, but it would be very expensive. You could make maple syrup in Mexico, but it would be very expensive. Trade is better. That's the standard economics textbook argument. But the research I've done with my co-authors on American tariffs and tariffs in general shows that the political economy is really the primary effect. Tariffs are something that businesses like and politicians like because they're a thing you can do a deal on. And so when you have an economy surrounded by tariffs, you're always doing a deal with the president or with Congress. You're trading. And business and government leaders trading things with each other, well, we have another word for that. It's called corruption. And so in Argentina and under import substitution in general, we see a huge rise in corruption because you have to do deals all the time. You're constantly renegotiating the subsidy position that you get from your government. And we see that in the US. So we looked at US steel tariffs in the 1980s. And what we found is after those, they were actually voluntary export restraints that were put in place of tariffs eventually. But when those went in, what we saw is that US CEO and steel CEO pay went up. Jobs in steel disappeared, so they didn't protect jobs. R&D in steel in the US almost disappeared. And lobbying by steel firms dramatically accelerated. And that makes sense because steel firms in the US learned that the way you make money isn't to do R&D, it's to lobby Washington for trade protection. And something that you make money at, you do more of. Something you don't make money at, R&D, you do less of. And so that's what we see across countries that are protected by tariffs. And I think that the thing that I find scariest is in our work, we found that once companies start getting into lobbying for trade protection, they double down on it and triple down on it and quadruple down on it because there's a thing in economics called learning by doing. And that seems to be very evident in lobbying for trade barriers. Once companies learn that they can lobby for trade barriers, get protection, make a lot of money doing that, they invest in it, they get better at it, they get better at it. And soon it's kind of the only thing that they know how to do. And so in that sense, trade protectionism is kind of like fentanyl. It's addictive to corporations because once they get into it, they just can't get out of it. And so what I'm worried is that Trump is going to create a nation of corporate fentanyl addicts in the United States, where all American companies are going to be lobbying constantly for US trade barriers. They're going to forsake research and development. And the US, maybe it could follow Argentina. I don't like the idea of having a third world country right on the border of Canada. I don't think that would be good for us. And so I really hope the Americans don't do this, but I can see it happening. And I think the Americans need to kind of remember Nancy Reagan and just say no to tariffs because they could kind of get into a lot of trouble. And I really hope the rest of us limit our retaliation to just retaliating against the US. And we really ought to maybe think about lowering our trade barriers with each other, even unilaterally, because the rest of us getting into an addiction to trade barriers and having our corporations become experts at lobbying for trade barriers and at very little else is a very unpleasant future to look at. Thank you.
Thanks. That was great, and I think it's a useful reminder again just to go and have that conversation about tariffs and a very straightforward conversation of the value on tariffs. I mean, also you're talking about the analogy with Perron. I thought it's the first time I'm hearing that, but I think it's a great analogy, frankly. And again, also you were talking earlier to that with regard to softwood lumber and all. I mean, Trump has initiated a Section 232 now on softwood lumber, so I think more is coming. And let me not preempt. Would others like to jump in? Enrique, any Anything to say? Let me ask a question then, both to Randall and to Patrick. Do you think there is a potential danger that in whatever negotiations now go forward with the Americans, Carney's out here, et cetera, you know, Canada has been a very strong rules-abiding nation. The rules which are there are the rules which are there, and we will abide them, even if it is to our detriment, but because the value of the rules are so important. And that has generally been the case with all advanced economies. The US is just an outlier in a way in that regard. But as we saw, last year, and this is when Trump wasn't even there was Biden out there, and Biden raised the tariffs to 100% on Chinese EVs and I think on semiconductors, the sectors in which he is making investments. And Trudeau was saying, okay, in some specific sectors, we will raise our barriers too, which would in effect turn out to would not be consistent with WTO rules. Do you feel that there's this possibility that Canada might get dragged in the name of trying to do some sort of deals with also having to kind of produce its own WTO commitments along the way? Randall, you first.
Yeah, I hope not. The free trade agreements with Europe and with different countries, Colombia, other countries in Latin America, are still there, and it's possible that a new order might develop around the European Union, perhaps. I mean, they're big enough that they could pull this off if they can act together and not undermine each other, as happened with the League of Nations. So I think that it's possible that there could be a system outside the US, which the US might at some point be able to rejoin if they can find a way to commit to a treaty, which is a big problem. I mean, we can sign a new USMCA or call it something else, but the question is, would anybody actually invest based on that going forward into the future at this point? Because it could be yanked out from under them at any minute. It's also not clear that helping the US with China is really going to work either. Canada kind of put itself in a bad situation with China over the Huawei executive who was detained at the Vancouver airport. That was done to help the US enforce its sanctions against Iran, which they claimed Huawei was violating. Canada really could have just exercised some strategic incompetence and said, oh, we're sorry, the plane took off. We didn't get a chance to grab her, but they did grab her. And the US has shown no loyalty whatsoever. There's been no thank you very much. No, because you're on our side, we're going to honor our trade commitments with you. So the problem is the US really needs to be able to commit. And I don't know how that can happen at this point. It's terrible to say it, but I don't know how it can happen. China, on the other hand, also has some issues. I mean, one of the things that we expected, I was involved in writing things saying, let China into the World Trade Organization. At the time, we were looking at South Korea, which after the end of the dictatorship in 1986 had dramatic labor cost increases. After 1986, when the last dictator, Chung, was overthrown, Korean labor costs went up and up and up, so that by the mid-1990s, they were closing in on European labor costs. And we thought, well, that could happen in China too. It hasn't. And so part of the reason China is a bit of a problem is that labor costs have remained low in China much longer than we thought they would. And that makes things produced in China by a highly productive labor force more expensive than we thought they would be going into the future. And understanding why labor costs in China have not risen to match those in other countries with comparable education and comparable economic development is an interesting subject that we probably need more research into. Something economists might look at more closely. I don't have a good answer to that.
Yeah, and that's something I think the Europeans could press a little harder now that the EU and China are trying to come back to the table and talk CAI. That's an area I think the EU should be pressing harder on, including subsidies.
Yes.
Patrick, quickly a little something on
Yeah,
yes,
just to add Yeah, just to add to what Randall said, it's yes, I think we didn't get anything for what we did vis-a-vis China to please the Americans, and we should not forget though that at the same time as this 100% tariffs on electric vehicles coming from China was imposed in Canada following the U.S., there was also a time when Canada was putting tens of billions of dollars on the table to attract investments in the EV supply chain, especially in batteries. So there was this kind of idea, well, are we going to undermine all this industrial policy to attract these investments? And but now most of these investments, some are ongoing, some have died. So we'll have to see what happens. But just on the rules-based approach, I think Canada is going to has been playing kind of a two-sided game in the sense that obviously now when partners are not playing by the rules, Canada is not going to say, well, we're going to play by the rules and get hurt, right? We're seeing this with the U.S. As soon as the threats came, the Prime Minister Trudeau at the time said, well, we're ready. And if we have to, we're going to retaliate. And Prime Minister Carney did the same thing and is saying the same thing. So in the sense that one has to be pragmatic. And I think this is where Canada, obviously, yes, we prefer to play by the rules, but if the other party is not going to play by the rules, then we're going to be hurt. And the only way to kind of de-escalate is maybe to escalate first and get a response from that to maybe negotiate something. Well, this is what's going to happen. So I think Canada is making very clear that we prefer playing by the rules, but if not, we are also able to play that game. We're just not going to say, well, we're going to play by the rules and just get hurt. So I think this is going to be the two-sided approach, and we're seeing this from other countries too. We're not the only ones.
Yes, Enrique, go ahead.
And just to follow up, Randall, I enjoyed very much your insistence on the credibility problem, as you put it, no? If we add the issue of the lack of innovation in the United States, a shift towards Asia, China, such as the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has highlighted. What does this mean, Randall, in the short and medium term, no? In terms of a global perspective, no? From a Gramscian perspective, we could say, well, the current is in crisis, the new one does not exist. Surprise, no? Chinese would say any crisis is a possibility, an option, no, to gain. What is your analysis on options in the short and medium term? Do you agree with Robert Lighthizer? We will end up with a small group of friends, no? I don't know.
Well, again, I mean, the U.S. has to prove that it can actually be friends with somebody. And, it's not clear right now that it can. It just kind of snarls at everybody. And that's not a way to build, a smaller group of closer friends, maybe rather than a broad group of acquaintances. But you still have to be nice to people, and you have to live up to your commitments. And you have to be able to stick to a deal when you do it. What can happen next? This could be very good for Canada. I mean, after World War II, European economies had a post-war boom. Economic growth was very high in France, Sweden, Germany, and so on after the end of World War II, because they had to rebuild infrastructure and they had to realign infrastructure for new trading patterns. So in Canada, you could have a building boom if we could build pipelines to ocean ports instead of to the US border, if we had to upgrade capacity in Montreal and Vancouver and Halifax so that we can trade with the rest of the world. There'd be huge construction booms in those sorts of places, and that would all show up as very high GDP. What I'm afraid of is that we would do what Latin American countries did under import substitution, and we would launch into industrial policies, where we would have the government of Juan Perón deciding that we should have this industry here and that industry there, and we should subsidize this industry and that industry. It didn't work. Governments have never been able to do that. Even Japan, which people still say was able to do that, didn't. There's a professor at the University of Alberta, Dick Beeson, who's done work with Professor Weinstein at Columbia, where they looked at the subsidies that Japan gave to its industries under MITI, and they discovered that the more subsidies you got from the Japanese government, the worse you did and the less innovative you were, because getting subsidies was more profitable than innovating. The really innovative firms that led Japan's post-war recovery did not get subsidies, were not part of the industrial policy, Honda, Toshiba, and so on. I think the real danger in Canada, especially with the Liberal government, is that they would decide we need a panel of experts to build battery factories here and to build solar energy factories here. And they're not going to know what they're doing. They think they will, but they won't, because governments have just never been able to do that. And we could end up getting into a lot of trouble. A big reason why the U.S. boom work, the European post-war boom worked was because government policy actually was mainly rebuilding things that had been blown up in the war. And so there wasn't that much thinking government technocrats had to do to repair a railway that already existed. We have some of that. In Canada, we need to build pipelines to Atlantic and Pacific Sea ports. We need to develop rare earths mining that's ecologically sensitive. We need to onshore certain supply chains, rearrange trade agreements. All of that will involve a lot of construction, a lot of investment, a lot of GDP growth. But we need to make sure that we don't kind of get into a kind of tyranny of experts where we have government technocrats who kind of are overconfident and get us into a lot of trouble. That's a big danger that also can happen under import substitution, because tariffs kind of lead to subsidies. Once you can lobby for tariffs, you can lobby for subsidies, and that can be just as destructive.
Thanks, Randall. Evgeny, Georgy, we're gonna come to you. Our next speaker is going to be Professor Georgy Egorov. He's with the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Georgy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sourabh, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I listened with great interest to what was being said, and I think it is a hugely important point, and I think that's pretty much gives probably a good insight into the future of what's going to happen. I want to kind of try to step back a little bit and try to understand the origins of what we are seeing now. And I think that it's virtually impossible to understand tariffs, I think, as was said, from like purely economic perspectives. From pure economics perspectives, tariffs almost never make sense. It's really like all about political economy. It's all about special interests and so on. And one thing that we probably need to admit, like going forward, is probably for the next, there is a sense in which globalization probably peaks in 2019. So it's probably like there's a hope that it's a local maximum, that when we come 20 years down the road, it will be a global world again. But at least for the foreseeable future, globalization is not there, and all the onshoring, reshoring, and so on, it's a symptom of that. And probably it's not only about tariffs, it's in general the perspective of reliability of supply chains that are going to matter. So in a sense, if you think about ripple effects of Trump tariffs, we can talk about all we want about how Canada is going to import parts from Japan or Korea, but if there is uncertainty about like long route supply chains, then even with zero tariffs, this is going to take a hit no matter what. So it's going to be, the reality is both from economic perspective and from geopolitical and perspective, we're going to see a more fragmented world, and that's probably it's going to outlast this Trump administration, and it's probably like I think the optimistic view is that it's going to take 20 years before we can come back to this question and to consider it again. So there is a lot of conversation about like international order, international law, and respect for that, and disrespect that's coming now. I think one thing I think is that friendliness and commitments and ability to make promises, they're important, but they're not the critical part of that. As we know, the agreements that have lasted for a long time, say the United Nations, were made between countries which were highly antagonistic and so on, but they were self-sustaining, and that's absent any other mechanisms at each point in time. Each administration, each general secretary in the USSR, and each president in the US and other countries of the Security Council, they found it better to have respect, or at least show respect to the United Nations than not to. So United Nations is in its own crisis, but that's a different story. But the point is that we need to think about like rules that are self-sustaining. And of course, the reality is that if you are a large country and or you think about yourself as a large country and able to be self-sustaining, then you are relatively free to violate laws. And we saw this with Russia, where I'm from, in the last 10 years, and we see this right now with the United States, if it counts. And I think realistically, if we see China as being respectful to the world order, it is only because it finds it's to be beneficial for itself at this moment in time, and we should not fool ourselves that a calculation would be different if somehow the calculations change. So I think that's kind of now. I think like my understanding of the origins of tariffs is that it's a kind of a confluence simultaneously of two things. So first of all, I don't think that my view of Trump is not like Trump likes tariffs. He says he does, but I think that's kind of second order. I think what we know of, and it was been said about corporations, politicians, and it's like 10 times true about Trump. Trump likes negotiations. Trump likes making deals and negotiations, maybe even more so. And so in as much as tariffs are an opening move into making any trade deals, like it's certainly beneficial for him. But then probably two more fundamental things is, first of all, the political economy of tariffs. And second is the general perspective of people in Washington. And this applies to both Republicans and Democrats, and to Biden administration, and as much as Trump administration, in that I know China accession to WTO was probably a mistake by what we see, and therefore something has to be done with that. On the political economy internal perspective, it's I think yes, a large part of Trump base are people who have or had manufacturing jobs, and certainly there is certain truth in the statement that free trade contributed to the loss of manufacturing jobs in the US. It's not the whole factor, like automation played a big role, and perhaps even bigger role in the grand scheme of things, but certainly free trade contributed to that. It might have helped the service industry, but it's not the same. So certainly people who had lost manufacturing jobs might be right in a sense to blame free trade for that. So of course, this does not imply that once you impose protectionist measures like trade, the jobs will come back. Reshoring and building factories is a long-term decision. So to achieve that, you not only need to, make tariffs permanent, you not only should commit to that. So everybody around looks and said, okay, we're not going to keep production in Canada or Mexico, China, we're going to reshore. So it requires a great deal of commitment, which might not be possible to achieve. So if you think about if you look 5 years from now and see how many jobs did these tariffs create, and the answer would be very small, say tens of thousands, one should not be surprised. But that said, it is a selling point. It sells, and I think from the perspective of political economy, from the perspective of Trump the politician, or Trump the salesman, certainly jobs are good. Higher prices for iPhones or toys are bad, and in a sense, talking about tariffs but not really delivering, which is in a sense like, okay, let's do crazy tariffs according to some formula, and then like try to, do as much as we can to roll it back. Ideally, with also negotiating something else. But I don't know, like to what extent Trump has commitment to not to roll it back if negotiations with, say, Mark Carney don't go well or something else. So I think, like from the political economy perspective, like talking about tariffs but not really imposing them is probably a good move. So that would be probably true if it was not for like this other effect, which is that yes, there's general awareness of about China in Washington, and kind of strategic confrontation, maybe not military one, but at least economic competition between the superpowers is certainly a big thing and probably worry. So I think like one thing about free trade that I think has been mentioned, people talk about, is that, okay, first of all, of course it creates economic gains and so on, but one of the benefit of trade is that it has been thought about as something that promotes peace, that countries that trade are reliant on each other and they would not engage in military conflicts. And in a nuclear world, of course, that's absolutely a first order benefit. Now, this benefit has to a large extent been downplayed, or at least diminished in their role by, well, to a large extent by Mr. Putin, who showed that, well, if you have a great reliance, mutual reliance with, say, Ukraine or later with Europe, it doesn't prevent you from doing big adversarial moves. And it took, and it's still taking, like Europe, a huge effort to, say, decrease its reliance on trade, say, on energy and gas from Russia. So to that extent, trade as something that builds, peace and builds trust is not necessarily there anymore. And so if you think about it, this probably builds up to the worry about that, okay, we cannot, Washington cannot predict what China is going to do. The other way around is also true. So it's, in a sense, we are back to like, it's the story of like US and Soviet Union, but with the rules of the game that have to be discovered from scratch. The status quo is that there is a lot of there is much trade between China and the United States, and which was not the case with US and the Soviet Union, like in the 50s. And in the sense that, and one would think that naturally this creates, this creates peaceful coexistence and like seeking mutually beneficial opportunities and agreements to be the natural way of things. But yet again, like Putin's actions in Ukraine have, I think, quite a bit undermined this logic. So I think that going back to tariffs, I think first order consideration is that there's a feeling that something has to be done with over-reliance on China. So therefore, we impose tariffs. I think most of other tariff actions around the world is, in some sense, is a spillover effect from that in its own right. So in the sense that the ideal outcome for, say, with like, if you think about, China, or if you think about Canada or Mexico, I think the ideal outcome for somebody who is thinking like Trump would be that, okay, let's go to a free trade agreements, but we are going to negotiate something in the meanwhile. It doesn't guarantee that it's going to happen, but like I suspect that this is what would be, the dream outcome for him. With China, I think the dream outcome is really reduction of trade and reduction of reliance on China in terms of imports, and that's probably the case. And yes, it doesn't help that say China has, as Professor Morck said, China has shown remarkable resilience to increasing of labor costs. So labor costs are still low there, and it's probably not. We'll see where it's going, but in a sense, it's going to maintain China as like a low-cost production place in the world for the foreseeable future. So in a sense, like that's I think it's understandable that if you want to decrease trade with China, if that's your imperative, then yes, something needs to be done. And I think the combination of political incentives of Trump and the general understanding of say you can call it China problem from Washington's perspective. I think the combination of that is what explains what's happening right now.
Can I just jump in with two quick ideas with which go to the theme of what you've talked about and others have talked about also? In terms of we had this conversation about labor costs in China. It's been derided a lot about Trump, the Mar-a-Lago Accord and all that stuff, which Stephen Meran and all have been this thing. But may it not be a bad idea if we can have a coordinated appreciation of all East Asian currencies? Frankly, they all run massive trades. I mean, Taiwan's trade surplus has been more than 10% of GDP for the last 15 years. Mm-hmm. I think none of them want to be caught out and be the only one doing so. But if there can be a coordinated East Asian appreciation of their currencies, I think that could have something to do with China's labor costs. It could be able to tackle that. Just throwing it out as an idea. The other idea I wanted to also throw out was, talking about how we are in a kind of a vacuum in terms of international law, international trade law, particularly because of this rule breaking, etc. That we don't have a forum where this is going to be sorted out immediately. This comes to a point which also Patrick talked about in terms of Canada doing a few things unilaterally. I mean, in terms of ready to have countermeasures and retaliate in certain areas. And here's my point. The Euros came up with industrial subsidies disciplines are not strong at the WTO, and the EU came up with the foreign subsidies regulation, and that might be a kind of a nucleus of a foundation for other countries, the advanced countries, to have that sort of foreign subsidies regulation, which is a pro-trade rather than anti-trade action. And China at least says that it wants ready to commit on stronger industrial subsidies disciplines. So we can be tackling industrial subsidies that way using the FSR as an exemplar. And we can also try to see if there can be appreciation. So, I mean, these kind of ideas can get thrown out. And let me come to you, Georgy, itself. What would you say on something like that?
Oh, thank you, Rob. So I think two questions here. One is the appreciation of currencies, and certainly like not being singled out and having a coordinated response might be beneficial for East Asian economies. There's no question about that. With that said, one should not underestimate China's ability to regulate labor costs through one means or the other. So, as we know, the history of Communist Party in the world in general, it's not something that necessarily makes the workers better off. So, certainly, despite the name, so certainly, I don't know to what extent that's a product of policy and to what extent that's artificial, but certainly China, if it wants, it would be able to undo this appreciation. The other thing is that with looking at the East Asian countries, one thing to remember is that China has historically had less than cordial relations with many of them until recent years. And so when we talk about issues of trust and friendship and agreements, it's certainly it certainly has an important role. So to what extent Vietnam or South Korea would and again, China is a dominant country there by the sheer size, both economic and population-wise. So in this sense, making any commitments on the part of China there is it would run into its own commitment problems for all these reasons. So I think as an idea, it's something that's interesting and might be beneficial for them. It's in terms of execution, it is difficult. And your second question was about retaliation. I think that, well, if anything, no, certainly it's clear how tariffs can lead to escalation, and I think one amazing thing that popped up almost immediately after tariffs were imposed is that please don't retaliate message from the White House. So in some sense, it's I mean, to me, it shows it shows like probably the ideal outcome from what they expected it to be. I think they this way, I don't know, we can talk about this about is it clumsy, is it not, but yeah, they probably tried to signal that like many of these tariffs are negotiation points and some symbolic gains that could be used for domestic purposes also is something that could work and so on. So now, the other point you mentioned is if there are any other regulations like limits on subsidies and some other agreements that can be made to make. Well, I think it's interesting, and I think like in a different world we could have seen that. We could have seen attempts to do that, to move in that direction, to have some other regulations to say are beneficial for trade, but do not create over reliance. But well, that's not the world we live in, and the reality is that Trump administration is doing it with the mechanisms and methods that it has at its disposal, and with the ones that it thinks it can use without any sort of congressional action.
Right. Let me, Randall, do you want to? Yes, Randall, just before we go to Randall, I just want to tell James that James, we have a full 15 discussion with regard to your listening for your statements, and then a discussion phase. So don't feel like you're going to get compressed. Just wanted to say that. Go ahead, Randall.
So my understanding is that when a nation signs a treaty, that treaty becomes part of its corpus of law. And it has a rank sort of maybe above provincial or state regulations, below federal regulations. It depends on the country, but a treaty is an act of Congress or an act of Parliament that is a law. And it's surprising to me that President Trump can simply tear up literally dozens of trade treaties by executive decree. We normally don't think of the leader of a Western European or OECD country ruling by executive decree. That's something that we associate with dictators in the tropics. Do you see a way that the U.S. can actually restore the legitimacy of the treaty it signs? Trump has declared emergencies like fentanyl crossing from the Canadian border and so on that are clearly bogus. And I sort of expected that to be challenged in court by Americans who were hurt by the tariffs. That hasn't really happened, or if it's happening very, very slowly and not in an overwhelming wave. There doesn't seem to be a pushback in the US against rule by executive decree. What's going on with that?
Yeah, sorry, good. Georgie, good.
Oh yeah, that's certainly an interesting situation. I think one thing is that there is so much going on is that courts are generally, overwhelmed, and so there are if you think about all the possible, things that could be litigated, it is a lot. And then on the day, a lot of that will have to come up to the Supreme Court to adjudicate based on what is executive power, to what extent this is or all these the treaties, to what extent the executive power to do foreign relations supersedes it or not. So I think that's a complicated question in the end of the day, and I'm not a constitutional scholar. I think in the end of the day, we know what happened in history. So we know that Franklin Roosevelt also tried to govern by decree to a large extent, and also tried to in the modern parlance, intermediate course and so on. And it stopped where his party said that's okay, there is some limits to that, you've gone too far. And so the same thing would happen. Well, we know that members of his own party stopped Nixon and led to his resignation. So in reality, I think realistically, this is the path to, to check on Trump's policies as well, if you wish. But that said, I think what Trump is doing is not exactly unpopular, at least with the electorate of the Republican Party, which is why what we see is we don't see a lot of defections.
Yeah, Randall, if I can just jump in very briefly, there are court challenges. The challenges have been put in, and even the government has put its argument out. Let me just say what the government's argument. I mean, I think it's bogus, but the government's argument is that these emergency powers are we are facing national security issue and foreign policy issue, not just a tariff issue. That courts, this is not something that is adjudicable in the courts, even though it should be a constitutional issue because Congress has the right to regulate. And what the administration says is that Congress can disapprove. Congress has the right to disapprove a declaration of a national emergency and use of these emergency powers, and it can do it in a fast-track manner, but Congress is not doing so. So, hey, judiciary, don't get into it. It's Congress's job. And Congress and the Trump administration has a sweetheart deal with the Republicans that in the first year, these things are not going to be challenged. Maybe second year and all that could be, but first year, no challenges to that the Republican House and the Republican Senate should not be supporting these sort of measures. Stay quiet, just do my bidding, and we can take, and all these things Congress can rear its head up again from next year onwards, not in the first year. And that's why there's been so much silence, and we have majorities there. And so even the Senate, which has tried to get ahead a little bit, because I mean, senators have their own minds, but it has not really worked in that regard. In the interest of time, let me go to James. And James will have a full 15 minutes. Please go ahead. James, Professor James Harrigan is Professor of Economics at the University of Virginia.
Okay, thank you. So there's almost no time left, but I hope I'll have time to make a few comments. Let me just quickly address something that my fellow panelists have talked about. It's been really informative and thought-provoking to listen. Both Randall and Georgy made a big point of the political economy of tariffs as being central, and I could not agree more. In fact, I think that's the best way to understand them. On a related point, there's been various discussions both here among this group and in the public discussion of how to make sense of Trump's policies. I think that's foolish. Trump's policies make no sense. There's no economic rationale behind them. There's no political rationale behind them. He is an extremely unstable person. And so applying economic analysis as if there's some strategy to what he's doing is just foolish. That's not what's happening. That said, as scholars and as serious people, we can still try to figure out the effects of these crazy policies. And I think that's what many of us have been trying to do. So I'm a trade economist. That's my specialty. I've been studying international trade for decades. And so I want to just bring a little bit of my thinking and my expertise to this discussion. So first of all, people like me, academic trade economists, we have a lot to say about the long run impacts of trade policy. A lot to say about trade agreements, the effects of them, things like that. We have much less insight into the very short run effects and almost nothing to say about the effects of daily or short run weekly policy notes. It's just, this is not something that we have anything to say about. Now, one thing which I can say as an economist more generally that I think most economists are familiar with is it's a very key idea from economic theory, which is that when business decisions entail large costs which are irreversible, what economists call sunk costs, then there's very strong incentives to delay any decision at all until uncertainty is resolved. So don't do anything until uncertainty is resolved. And I think this is likely a very key channel for what the current trade policy crisis is doing. It's reducing investment. It's not It's going to take a while for this to show up in the figures. We may or may not have a recession. But in thinking about what does this short-run insanity, this completely chaotic trade policy environment do, it creates uncertainty in businesses. Optimally, are going to say, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to invest in the US. I'm not going to invest in anywhere. I'm just going to the extent possible, wait. Now, suppose that this does become permanent. Suppose that the US does shift permanently toward a much less open trade policy. And if businesses believe that that's true, then I think we can, as a trade economist and somebody who studied these issues, I can have an informed opinion. So first of all, I think it is plausible that a lot of manufacturing would return to the US. If you put up permanent tariffs on manufacturing trade, and if businesses perceive those as permanent, we're going to get reshoring, whatever you want to call it. What I think is less well understood, I think it was maybe, I forget who was, maybe it was Georgie or somebody else alluded to this. Just increasing manufacturing output is not going to increase manufacturing employment. So manufacturing employment as a share of the workforce has been declining in a straight line in the United States since 1945. And if you look at that share, you can look at it, if you really squint, you can see effects of trade policy, but the long run trend is that the US manufacturing is employment, not output, employment is just declining. And that's because of automation. So if we bring back manufacturing output to the US, we'll create jobs for robots, not for people. Now, what's the long-term effect of that on the US? In the long run, it makes the US somewhat poorer. I mean, this is what Randall was alluding to. I don't think we're going to go the Argentina direction, but we'll be somewhat poorer, but the effects will be relatively small. The US is a big country. We can produce a lot of things ourselves. The hyper-globalization of the US is a relatively recent phenomenon. But the fairly small long-run effects on overall US GDP, I think it'll be worse for other countries, certainly way worse for Canada and Mexico, who are much more dependent on the US market than vice versa. And then finally, to the extent that this policy turn is motivated by anything or has a political roots, it's this kind of stagnation of less educated workers, which we've seen since around 1980. And there's been some rebound recently, but this kind of long-run trend of increasing wage inequality, increasing wealth inequality in the U.S. is real. That's true. That's happening. I've been trying to figure out the role of trade in this policy, in this trend since the 90s, and I haven't found anything yet. The role of globalization and trade policy and increasing inequality in the U.S. is in my view second order, maybe even third order. It's primarily a U.S. political phenomena, and it's a phenomenon about technology. So that's we're out of time. That's my contribution to the conversation today.
Great. You raised an important point, James. In terms of there will be quite a lot of local manufacturing. Are we seeing a world where we are going to get into what is called a kind of a local for local strategy? This has been discussed in terms of China because the US was in the Biden administration wanted to rupture those supply chains running through China. But China is a big market, so many of the East Asian manufacturers say, we need a local for local strategy. And so in the US also now, because the tariffs are so high, it's not to do with kind of, because in case of China, China was designated as a foreign entity of concern, so you couldn't run your supply chains through there. So you needed to have only a supply chain for China. In this case, it's because of the tariffs, it's kind of, we'll be seeing more of a local for local strategy. And do you think that will involve its North American partners? And in your view also, one, if I could just throw another question, where do you see, there has been, even in the chat, a little discussion about even if it's American manufacturing, local for local, there is a potential for Canada and the US to kind of work as an integrated market. Maybe Trump is not there forever after all, but that Mexico might be dropped from the existing North America market. Where do you come down on that issue? How do you see the future in this?
So I don't really come down anywhere on that. So I come down on we have no idea what's going to happen because we have no idea what tariff policy is going to be on Monday. I mean, I don't object to people speculating on thinking what if this happened, but we're not going to know anything until we know what's permanent, and we're not going to know what's permanent. I don't know when we're going to know what's permanent. I go back to my kind of fundamental economics point, which is that businesses are not going to make decisions until they figure out what's going on, and we don't know when that will happen. Maybe after the next elections, maybe after Donald Trump leaves office. I don't know, but the profound uncertainty that any business leader is facing is going to prevent them from making any major moves if they can possibly avoid it.
Great. Any closing comments from any of the other panelists at this point of time?
Well, if I can add, I mean, I agree with James that it's very difficult for business. I think what they will do is, marginal adjustments, as we've seen, in some cases, it's like instead of exporting to Canada or Mexico from the US, well, if you're a Japanese manufacturer like Subaru, which announced that now they were going to export some of their cars from Japan to Canada. And so I think you're going to see more and more of these types of adjustments, and maybe ultimately will lead to a reduction in operations in the US, and hoping that, at some point, all this economic pressure will lead to more stable deals. But yeah, we are in a period of uncertainty that is not about to go away. I think, the threats are still there. There are deals, it's not clear that they mean anything. Even if there's a deal's announced, normally it's like a deal to make a deal type of thing, and part-time elements. So I think for countries that obviously outside of the US, like Canada and Mexico, well, the only thing maybe right now where they can provide stability is either within, investments within their own countries, that's been mentioned by Randall and others, and trying to reinforce or develop economic relations with other partners that, in a way where there are free trade agreements, there are these kinds of things, and say, okay, well, at least there we can have some certainty. And if you're not going to invest in the US or in North America for the North American market, or between the US and other countries, well, maybe there are investments that can be done in other places, because we're still talking about a big chunk of the world economy. So it's not, we talk about the US and China, but it's not, they don't represent, they represent a big chunk, but they're still an important part of the world economy that goes beyond them, and we should not kind of forget that those countries can also work together. I'll leave it at that.
Please go ahead, Enrique.
Yes,
yes.
I believe.
Another meeting.
Okay.
Everybody. I believe we will see in the next weeks and months until July of this year lots of shifts. No, on the one hand, the only topic I humbly believe the President Trump is I don't know if scared of, but he fears are the markets. No, as we saw on April 9th. The stock markets, but mainly the interest rate of bonds, 10 and 20-year long bonds of the US Treasury, have been reacting very negatively. No? And this is the reason why we have this truce of 90 days. No? A and B, we will have to see how China reacts in this discussion. No, I mentioned in the chat that on May 13th there will be the CELAC China meeting. CELAC is the Community of Latin American Countries, and this could be a fundamental issue in terms of highlighting, what, I make a difference. While Mr. Trump is putting tariffs at the 3-digit level, I erase them, or I divide them by 2. No, this symbolic gesture can make an enormous difference for the short and medium term. Thank you.
Georgie, did you have something to say?
Yes. No, I want to say that it's totally true that in the world of uncertainty, firms will generally tend to postpone like big investments and so on. But also, I think Patrick mentioned that if anything, firms would tend to invest in their own country just because it's kind of kills any reliance. And so, in as much as I think this is the point where uncertainty in its own plays into the playbook of Trump. So, if Trump is to minimize world trade, then uncertainty that's created by his actions. Both trade between U.S. with other countries and between other countries on their own. Uncertainty in itself plays in his direction for now.
Randall, any final last closing statements?
To end on a positive note, I mean, it would be great if labor costs in China rise so that people stop complaining that China is a cheap labor, unfair competitor country. It would be great if the Supreme Court in the U.S. would severely limit the president's ability to rule by decree so that the U.S. can actually sign treaties and live up to them. It would be great if all the rest of the world reduces tariffs with each other and the U.S. kind of realizes that it's made a mistake. All of those things, I think, would be great. I think there could be an investment boom as countries reorganize supply chains, and high investment is actually helpful, and lower trade barriers between Canada, Europe, Latin America, Asia, all kind of are things that might happen. So there could be good that comes out of this. I don't see this working out very well for the US in the long run. I think the worst holdover from this will not be Canada, Mexico. I think there are options for adoption that we could follow if we are smart. But I don't see this working out well for the U.S., even in the medium term, even in the short term. I just worry about the U.S., and I don't like the idea of a poor, unstable U.S. That's bad for the world.
Thanks, Randall. Patrick, anything? Did you have something to say? Right. Yeah, okay. We're run over time. I'm going to bring the session to a close. I think this was a great conversation. I think this is a conversation which needs to be continued because we still are going to live in this age of uncertainty for quite a long time. But thank you for that optimistic note. And I think it's useful also for all of us. The US is doing many things which we would prefer not to be doing, but also just shines a light to how much it has underwritten the public goods in the international system for so long. And if other countries really can step up, I think it would be a good thing in the larger scheme of things. Once again, thanks everybody for participating, and to our panel and to our audience, a small apology that we would next time, it's on me, we would like to have a lady also on this panel. We could not get a lady to join us on this panel. We would like it so as to have a little bit more of a diverse showing on the panel, but nonetheless, the conversation was great. Let me take the opportunity to thank once again Patrick Leblond, Enrique Dussel Peters, Georgy Egorov, Randall Morck, and Mr. Harrigan also, who has left. Have a good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you, Sourabh.
Thank you, Sourabh. Thank you. Great conversation.